Welcome. Welcome to this webinar put on by the R5 Foundation and KNEKS, as well as the Islamic Economy Community MES and Prudential Indonesia. Before we get going, I just wanted to welcome everyone from the R5 Foundation. The topic of this webinar is a universal appeal, a perspective from non-Muslims about the shared values and inclusivity in Islamic finance, which is a particularly relevant topic for me and for R5 because our foundation is really focused on building the links between responsible finance and Islamic finance, which is all based around this shared value and inclusivity. And so to get going, before we have the welcoming addresses, I'd like to invite Mohammed Faris Afif for a Quranic recitation.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A'udzu billahi minasy syaithanir rajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alladzina amanu wa amilus solihati tuba lahum wa husnu ma'ab. Kadzalika arsalnaka fi ummatin qad khalat min qabliha umamul litatlu alaihim alladhi awhayna ilaika wa hum yakfuruna birrahman. Qul huwa rabbi la ilaha illa huwa alaihi tawakkaltu wa ilaihi matab. Walau anna Qur'anan suyirat bihil jibalu aw qutti'at bihil ardu aw kullima bihil mauta bal lillahil amru jami'a. Afalam yai'asil ladzina amanu allau yasha'ullahu lahadanan nas allau yasha'ullahu lahadan nas jami'an wa la yazalul ladzina kafaru tusibuhum bima sana'u qariyatun aw tahullu qariban min darihim hatta ya'tiya wa'dullahi innallaha la yukhliful mi'ad. Shadaqallahul azim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Walaikum assalam, and thank you. I'd like to move right into our welcome addresses. First, from KNEKS, Dr. Sutan, Emir, Hidayat, Director of Education and Research. Would you like to give your welcome address, please?
Please activate my video if you don't mind, the host. Can you see me now? Black, can you see me?
No, I can't.
I don't know what happened.
Sorry, sir, we can.
You can see
Now,
me?
yeah, now someone sharing, yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Mr. Jens Reisch, President Director of Prudential Indonesia, Ibu Nini, Director of Prudential Indonesia, distinguished speakers who come from many parts of the world, all participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon to the speakers and participants from Southeast Asia. And I'm sure good morning to the speakers and participants from the Middle East and Europe. And what about you, Black? What time is it now in the US?
It's 11 p.m.
Okay, so I still can say good evening to you, right? So good evening to speaker and participants from the US, and salam kebajikan to all of us. Firstly, let us praise and thank Allah the Almighty for His grace and mercy. We may gather here virtually in this good event. It is my great pleasure to address at the opening of today's international webinar. On behalf of KNEKS management, I would like to express my utmost appreciation and warmest gratitude to our co-organizers of this event. The first one, Masyarakat Ekonomi Syariah Indonesia, Islamic Economic Society Indonesia. Second one, Prudential Indonesia. And of course, the RFI Foundation for co-hosting this webinar on this very interesting topic. The central economic belief of Islam is to develop a prosperous and egalitarian economic and social system wherein all members of society, either Muslim or non-Muslim, can maximize their intellectual capacity, preserve and promote their faith, health, and wealth among generations, and actively contribute to the economic and social development of the society. From this perspective, Islamic economics and finance offer an alternative and viable framework that can play an important role in achieving sustainable development and boosting shared prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, the world has witnessed how the economic and business practices without moral values have resulted in tremendous social gaps and environmental crisis. Therefore, several terms of moral practices in the economic life have emerged in order to respond to the current challenges, such as ethical consumerism, fair trade, and socially responsible finance and investment, or impact investing. These terms are also marking the shift of paradigm in economic and business practices. The whole concepts mentioned above are naturally contained in the Islamic economy and finance. If I may mention Prof. Azmi's quote, Prof. Azmi is the president of INSIF. At one of the conferences, he mentions that Islamic finance and impact investing, a match made in heaven. The Islamic economy and finance represents the philosophical value of responsibility and justice. In the market point of view, the sense of responsibility is expressed on how consumers deal with the consumption and investment activity that comply with the ethical and moral principles. It inherently demands the creation of sustainable products or instruments at the end of the day. Therefore, it is no surprise that impact investing and blended finance, for instance, have a positive trend. According to Nielsen study in 2015, 66% of the global consumers are willing to pay extra money for value-based and sustainable products. For many conventional investors and financial services practitioners, Islamic or Sharia-compliant financial services are synonymous with restrictive interpretation of the Holy Quran as applied to the financial sector. Sharia compliance extends to a way of structuring financial transaction such as money has no intrinsic value alone and therefore cannot be a commodity with value to be bought or sold. Second, transaction promotes a large social good through risk sharing. Third, clear contractual terms in which contract must be explicit in terms of expectation and contribution by both parties for sharing both up and down. And fourth, zakah or charitable giving. This concept goes beyond conventional impact investing negative screen for SRI or ESG or even Sharia screens for halal stock. This is meant to be an active response to helping those in need and many other noble and universal values from Islamic economy and finance. These are actually not restrictive guidelines, but a framework that differs from conventionally structured financial products. Ladies and gentlemen, various countries, even non-Muslim majority countries, are joining Islamic economy and financial market. For example, the Central Bank of India has begun a review of regulation on Islamic banking. The City of Hong Kong, China's Legislative Council, passed the loans bill in 2014, enabling the government to raise money through sukuk. The Philippines is entering the global takaful industry as the Insurance Commission of the Philippines is formulating takaful regulation that enables takaful services in the country. Even variety of large multinational organizations have Islamic units, which include KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, EY, Dow Jones, S&P, Bloomberg, and others. Even the United Kingdom itself declared to be the center of Islamic finance in the Western countries. In halal industry context, there is a great excitement coming from other non-Muslim countries as well. According to State of the Global Islamic Economy Indicator in 2019, Brazil and Australia, for instance, are the biggest suppliers for halal poultry and halal beef in the world, respectively. China has inked a $1 billion agreement for a halal food manufacturing and processing plant in Dubai, while South Korean government is currently supporting the development of halal cosmetic and pharmaceutical. Ladies and gentlemen, in academic world, there are plenty non-Muslim scholars who also agree on Islamic economics and finance concept. They have been giving lectures in many renowned universities in the world. Among them are Professor Rodney Wilson from Durham University in the UK, Professor Frank Vogel from Harvard Law School, Professor Samuel Hayes from Harvard Business School, Professor Simon Archer, Henley Business School, University of Reading. Moreover, based on the Islamica 500 report, every year there are also individuals who made impact towards Islamic financial industry and Islamic economy in general. And among them are non-Muslim, such as Firuz Alana, founder of Alana Group India, Andreas Andreadas, executive chairman of Temensos Fintech based in Switzerland, Kiri Andreu, co-founder of Atta Plus in Malaysia, Juan Aranos, CEO of Nestle Malaysia, and many other leaders. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I encourage and welcome all speakers to share their views and knowledge on this important issue to open our mind regarding the shared values and inclusivity of Islamic finance. Finally, I do hope all of you will have productive dialogue and fruitful discussion during this webinar that will considerably contribute to the greater knowledge and much better understanding on Islamic economy and financial system. Most importantly, it has universal appeal. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. And I'd like to hand it over, I think with that great introduction, hand it over to Jens Reisch, from President Director of Prudential Indonesia, to give his welcoming remarks before we get going introducing the speakers.
Thank you very much, Blake, and also terima kasih banyak, Dr. Hidayat. On behalf of Prudential, I want to also welcome all the participants from Indonesia, from outside Indonesia. Virtually, at the moment, we cannot see from everywhere people are calling in, but it's great to connect with everyone for a shared vision, and also, I think, for a joint learning. I want to thank also KNEKS, also MES, and also RFI for together jointly setting up this session. And I would like also, just as an opening remark, maybe reflect on the experience Prudential Indonesia is going through in Indonesia. It has been an exciting journey, and I'm happy just to share maybe some flavor, some food for thought. So thanks a lot. It's not many slides. Maybe we can start right the next one. But I'm sure for all of you who know Indonesia a little bit, know that there is a huge potential. And I think there's also a big shift which is visible. I think the modern liberal and inclusive lifestyle of Muslims, and also I think of the Indonesian society as such, maybe we can see the next slide, is at the moment, I think this one, I just want to highlight, reflects a little bit, I would say, the journey and the experience we are in. I can maybe talk and share a little bit more about the insurance experience we have. Of course, the country is the largest Muslim country with 87%. And I know this seminar and this webinar is basically focusing on the 13% non-Muslims. But let me maybe also share, I think, at least for Prudential, and also to make halal industry in all aspects growing, we have, I think, two objectives. Of course, one, to be inclusive, and also one, I think, still to train and teach and promote to all the Muslims as well, that the Sharia or the halal solution is there. We see, of course, in Prudential, we still have many Muslim agents who do not yet sell Sharia as their first product. So I think inclusiveness, I would see maybe broader, of course, capturing all non-Muslims and basically promote the Sharia principles as universal values, but also I think to give confidence and give knowledge to all the Muslim friends here in Indonesia, to whether it's customers, whether it's agents, to also see this opportunity. I mean, I think Dr. Hidayat, of course, would maybe know the market in much more detail, but we can still say the journey is growing for Sharia in insurance, and also I think in the financial services industry. However, it is still fairly small. So positively thinking, there is a huge potential. You still see single-digit growth. You still see probably single-digit or lower double-digit growth in contribution. And I just highlighted openly the journey of Prudential. We are now in year 13. Our company is 25 years now operating in Indonesia. 13 years ago, we started the Prudential Sharia business. And we are still also, I think, growing fairly well, but we are still also in the lower double digits. So I think clearly our aspiration is also going beyond. And the life insurance industry still, only 19 million people have a life insurance policy in Indonesia. Around 2 million plus is maybe with Sharia based. So I think there is still a potential to grow, and the penetration, especially for Sharia, needs to be, I think, addressed, especially as it is even lower in terms of financial literacy, Sharia literacy, than the normal insurance literacy we have. Can I see the next slide? Is just, I think, showing our journey. And I highlight maybe just some learnings, which maybe can be interesting or relevant for all. As I mentioned, Prudential started our journey in 1995, 2007. So 13 years ago, we started our Sharia business. And until 2016, I can say Prudential successfully, I think, promoted, sold Sharia products. 2016, we actually collaborated among the management, and I think Bunini is on the line. She's leading our Sharia business with our Sharia team. We explored actually that we should shift Sharia from a pure product positioning to a bigger mainstream core business and a business preposition. So 2016, Bunini took charge and formed a team, and we made, I think, Sharia business more mainstream. We also made it more inclusive. So this is actually the year when we promoted and started to share our tagline and our commitment, Sharia for all, Sharia untuk semua. So this is actually, I think, a starting point, and it bears good fruits. If I see the last 3 years, we have basically now 100,000 agents. It's not yet all agents, but I think the majority, I think, is seeing also the opportunity, whether Muslim or non-Muslim. And of course, for us, it's maybe both. As I said, our Muslim agents to convince that the first offering they do to customers is a Sharia offering. And also when they meet non-Muslims, how to address that Sharia products basically carry the principle of the Sharia values, which is helping each other, also being ethical with regard to investments, which I think resonates very, very much to the community and to consumers here in Indonesia. And the last point is actually last year and this year is the first time that we created signature products for Sharia. I have to say, on behalf of my industry, we still have to get better. A lot of companies and a lot of markets basically is still like copy pasting. Whatever is conventional, we copy paste to Sharia. But actually, I still see the big aspiration is to create tailored Sharia signature product. We have launched, I think, one which is very successful called Cinta. Cinta means love. So actually, it's also, I think, being caring, doing good for your loved ones. And I think the latest one is only 1 week old, is Protect Care. The name doesn't show Sharia, but it is a Sharia compliant product, which we now digitally, as small as 8,000 rupiah, so very, very small premium per month, want to actually now distribute digitally. So really, I think making insurance and Sharia available for all. Okay, maybe next. I think Wakaf is also one, I think, which is still growing. So this is maybe just to share a little bit the data. I think it's still a young journey and probably too early to celebrate big, but I think our promotion of Sharia for all to be inclusive, and also I think to help promoting this in the wider societies through financial literacy events and so on. I'm very happy and thankful for KNEKS and also for MES. We collaborate very, very closely, I think, for the shared vision to promote Sharia, making sure Muslims and non-Muslims understand the universal value of Sharia. In 2019, if you just see, I mean, at least our non-Muslim customers basically is now 21% of our customer base in Sharia. And actually we see the highest growth rates in Sharia from non-Muslim customers. This is last year's data. So I think it's a first encouraging step, and we should hope to think big. And we hope also that many of other colleagues, players, peers, stakeholders in the market will join us. Next. My last slide is, I may just say, I think to make really halal in all aspects big. And I think the president, the vice president in Indonesia shared the vision to be leading in the world. And I think the potential is clearly there. The players we have, it's now about forming partnerships, forming alliances, which players connect for a shared vision, shared purpose, shared values. We have to do product innovations with a good Sharia angle in mind, not only copy pasting. We need to sell not only through agents and banks, but also digital and in a collective way. The business expansion, this is, I think, about forming partnerships, alliances. In Indonesia, we have so many now great digital companies. How can we connect with all industries, food, tourism, pharmaceutical, cosmetics, fashion, finance, media, for the joint purpose of promoting and leading halal. I think continue to train our financial advisors, banks. I think we have the aspiration as Prudential, that's I think Bunini is also target to have a Sharia knowledge center, really helping the industry to promote the principles of Sharia. And we formed partnerships in Indonesia, say with OFO or Tokopedia, to promote Sharia product also digitally. A big, I think, job still lies to do education. Without education, I think it is tough to really get the message across throughout this big country like Indonesia until those many, many islands. So financial literacy, the Sharia literacy and inclusion, I think is core. And finally, I think like maybe probably also some banks and some other insurance company, we have the aspiration to spin off and make Sharia also an own company. I think that is maybe the next big step. And also I think the next commitment. And I think with this, I just say, thank you very much for sharing, I think, the aspiration and the vision to grow and make Sharia a leading concept. It is, I think, good for society, good for the economy, and I think good for business. And last but not least, stay healthy, everyone. This is the 4 aspirations. One of them, society, I think, good for business. We have, of course, 4 other aspirations to make Indonesians healthier, also to make sure that our agents are professionally, digitally savvy, and to promote our insurance to all Indonesians. But I think it is important, it all starts with an aspiration, a public commitment, and as Prudential, one of our big public commitments is to be a leading contributor and supporter to Indonesians' Sharia industry. Terima kasih banyak and have a good workshop, and I hope we can learn from each other through this next 2 hours. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you for the introduction. I think there were a couple points that really touch on what we're going to discuss from here on out about the broader value proposition that Islamic finance really has to show to reach and engage with non-Muslim population, because there's not the natural appeal of it just because it's Sharia compliant that it's appealing for a non-Muslim audience. So we'll transition now into the discussion with our panelists. We're going to start with an introduction by each of them, including myself. I'm panelist and moderator both today, and I'll start by just asking each of our panelists to give 1 or 2 minutes to quickly introduce themselves and share one specific example from Islamic finance that perfectly summarizes why it's of interest to you. And I'll start with myself. My name is Blake Goud. I'm the CEO of the Responsible Finance and Investment Foundation, which is a nonprofit that's globally operating. I'm in the US. We have a footprint across Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Very active board of trustees and advisory board who've supported our mission to connect Islamic finance and responsible finance together based on these shared values, shared principles that have attracted me to Islamic finance. And I think from the specific example that I would give as to where Islamic finance can offer something completely different and unique and valuable to society is something that was developed by the International Federation of Red Cross or Crescent Societies and the Islamic Development Bank to use a sukuk to fund the One Wash program for water, sanitation, and health. And it's a way of mobilizing funds that's fairly unique compared to traditional social impact bonds. It includes different features to make it more, to do a better job of connecting the risk to the people, to the parties that are best able to bear it. And in doing so, it's funding something that's very core, something core to the objectives beyond just generating financial return for the investors. And so I think that's been one thing that's been very appealing, and the use of waqf, I think in particular, and other forms of Islamic social finance have a real potential to connect to non-Muslims in a different way than commercial products. And so I'd like to just I'll wrap up myself and then pass it along to Svyatoslav Suvorov, if he wants to introduce himself and give an example of something in Islamic finance that summarizes why it's of interest to him.
Right. Thank you, Blake, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. As a student at the time of Sutan, and it was actually a pretty exciting experience of living and studying Islamic finance in Bahrain. Back in 2008, 2009, while I was in the US and I was finishing my major in conventional finance, the financial crisis has hit, and obviously there were a lot of things going on in the financial world. On the other side, I did not know it by that time. There was such a thing as Dubai World Example, right, which was also hit by financial international crisis. And at the end of my studies, I went on a World Economic Forum in Bahrain, where I learned a little bit more about Bahrain as a country, because it was like, you know, for me, it was like a different planet, to be honest. And I spent there only about 3 days. However, then back in 2010, I think, or maybe, yeah, 2010, then I was invited by a friend of mine to spend 2 weeks during the summer. I did not know what summer is in Bahrain, because it was 50 degrees Celsius and you could feel the air with your hands. So it was very, very hot. For me, coming from Moscow, you know, we got cold winters here, and even after living in the U.S., still it was very, very hot. And during that 2-week visit, the friend of mine showed me the University College of Bahrain, and told me, like, you know what, there's such a thing in Islamic finance. I'm like, what, Islamic finance? Does it have something to do with religion? He's like, not exactly. So I decided to apply and to enroll into this university. So I did it, and then I started my studies, and I found it very interesting, because before enrollment, I started reading more about Islamic finance, and I realized that the concepts of Islamic finance that are based on, some of them that are based on moral and ethics and other stuff, they could have been used in new world financial system, in order to avoid crises like that are based on you know, over credit, overproduction, and other stuff. And also having a background from Russia, knowing what is equality and other stuff that was implemented in USSR, and why it didn't work, it was very interesting to combine all three and see the results. So that's when I moved to Bahrain and lived there nearly 2 years while doing my MBA in Islamic finance and learning more about it. After that, I came back to Moscow, where I worked on first. We tried to implement between VTB Bank and Kuwait Financial House Sukuk issuance. After years of sending emails back and forth, it became clear that neither party was able to do that, because of, first of all, lack of liquidity. Both banks didn't want to pay, basically, and also lack of transparency. Both parties did not know how to talk to each other. Like Russian bank, they did not really know anything about Sukuk, and Kuwait Financial House, they were more interested in raising money from the Russian party. After several years, there was another attempt to implement Islamic finance in Russia, where me and my colleagues, I have to say a little bit of where I work, right? So I work as an investment director in a fund called G Capital Advisors. We have several product lines. We got a fund that is doing investment in fixed income instruments in regions like Southeast Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, parts of Western Europe. So the strategy is based high yield, high risk, high return, investing in private and mutual bonds. The second fund that we have is the venture capital private equity fund, where we hold almost 30 investments in companies from stages Series A to pre-IPO stage. One of our companies in biotechnology just went IPO'd, but it's interesting to note that we're investors in Goud, which is an Indonesian mobility company. And I would like to touch bases on what Goud is doing in promoting halal or non-promoting halal or Islamic principles or Sharia principles to its investors. Most of its investors are conventional investors, and obviously, you know, there could be some dialogue around this field, which is not happening. And finally, we got a biotechnology hedge fund, and these are our three main products. Right. So within this company, once we tried to think about how we can start an Islamic pension fund in Russia, and did a lot of research about why it could not be done. And maybe later we could come back to the discussion of these points. So I guess this is pretty full introduction. So again, thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be part of it and looking forward to discussing the topics. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite Charles Frans to introduce himself and share something from an example from Islamic finance that explains his interest. Yeah, I think you're still on mute.
Di unmute.
There.
Unmute now.
There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Black. I would like to thank KNEKS and MES and RFI Foundation and Prudential Indonesia who organized this meeting and inviting me in this meeting. I want to say hello and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to all panelists and participants in this meeting. My name is Charles Frans. I'm a member of Masyarakat Ekonomi Syariah, Islamic Economic Community, Ternate, Indonesia, and currently working at Wahana Visi Indonesia as Program Manager for Ternate area. Wahana Visi Indonesia is a Christian humanitarian organization that works to bring a sustainable change to the welfare of children, families, and community living in poverty, regardless their religion, race, ethnicity, or gender. Inspired by our Christian values, we are dedicated to working with the most vulnerable people. In the last few years, Wahana Visi Indonesia facilitated a sustainable platform for families, called it Accumulating Saving and Credit Association, or ASCA. ASCA trains communities to organize a group that provides simple saving and loan facilities to them that do not have access to formal financial services. This group is mostly located in rural areas. When we developed ASCA, we found questions from members about the interest of ASCA, which they called riba or usury. And in Islam, it is forbidden. As Christian organization, we are fully aware that we work in Muslim majority area. Of course, the program that we develop for community must not violate with Islamic values. That was the beginning for us to find out about Islamic finance and finally became a member of Islamic Economic Community in Ternate. That's all, Pak Black. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction, and we could move on now to Philippe Fustenberger. Do you want to give an introduction of yourself?
I think Mr. Philippe is disconnected for
Okay.
a moment.
We'll wait. We'll move on, and when he rejoins, we'll hear from him. Margie Ong, would you like to introduce yourself and share something about your background and exposure to Islamic finance that explains your interest and why you're here today?
Of course. Thank you so much, Blake. Hello, selamat tengah hari, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you to the organizers. Now, really quickly, in terms of an introduction. So my name is Margie Ong, and I'm the CEO of an organization called Thoughts in Gear. We're based in Malaysia. And we do two main things. So first, we work on sustainability with corporations, and we bring them through the sustainability journey. And secondly, we work on social impact with funders and nonprofits, very much in the area of impact measurement. Now, interestingly, we had the privilege of working with two of the largest standalone Islamic banks in Malaysia for sustainability, truly taking them from the very start of their sustainability journey all the way to one of them actually winning Asia's best sustainability strategy. So it's been quite an experience and quite a journey. And I must say, if I had to quote one example, and I think it's more to do very much with, both the clients that we saw, it's very much to do with the universality of the principles of Sharia, very much in terms of how it was ingrained within the DNA and the mindset of the organization itself, in terms of its purpose, in terms of its decision-making process as well. And in terms of really being able to validate what I would say more the overlap rather than the uniqueness as well, is we've recently evaluated about 57 companies from a sustainability and ESG perspective. And it was extremely interesting to see the large areas of overlap with Islamic Sharia principles in general, not just in finance, but in terms of the finance institutions, how well they scored because of that overlap as well. And I'm sure we'll explore a lot more of that during the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margie. And we can move on to Lisa Silaban. Do you want to introduce yourself and explain an example that may have come from your KNEKS or otherwise that explains what about Islamic finance has been interesting, particularly for you?
Thank you, Public. Hello, everyone. Good day from Indonesia. I hope you are all healthy and well. I'm Lisa Mariana Silaban as an Assistant Director at National Committee for Islamic Economy and Finance. We can call KNEKS, the Republic of Indonesia. My main task is to support the deepening of Islamic financial market in Indonesia. I joined KNEKS since last year. Prior to that, I worked in the Ministry of National Development Planning, or Bappenas, for 5 years. And then the reason why I was involved in the early establishment of KNEKS and then getting to know about Islamic finance was started with the invitation from Pak Pungki Sumadi, who was my director at the time. From him, I learned that Islamic finance, despite its name, is not a religious product or about Islam as a religion, but more importantly, as a complete system of life that is based on legal prescriptions, moral and good conduct, while other religious codes provide guidance only for the relation between us and our Creator. My view is that Islamic finance principles are fundamentally aligned to most systems of ethics adopted by human and can be regarded to be universal values for good. The key point is that the core principles of Islamic finance are fixed and don't change over time, as they are rooted in religion. Strict prohibition of certain forms of interest or riba and resharing for all parties. Somehow it prevents people from undertaking real economic activities. So hope we can enjoy this talk show. Thank you, Public.
Thank you. And I think we have Philippe back with us. And so I'll turn it over to him to ask him to introduce himself and give one specific example that explains something in Islamic finance that captivated your interest and why you're here today as a result. Did we? Yeah. I think he may have dropped off again, so we can give him an opportunity to introduce himself when he joins back in, and we can move on into the discussion phase. And I think there's one common thread that I've picked up from everyone is that there's this value of this universal value in Islamic finance that we've seen as being attractive to non-Muslims, and for many different ways that they've been exposed to Islamic finance initially. There's something common in our shared values that keeps us engaged. I know that's been the case for me for I think about the last 15 years. Is that it really started and has now evolved more to be aligned with responsible finance, which shares some common origins. If you trace back responsible finance back to socially responsible investing, that has religious origins as well, which may explain some of the commonality in broader objectives. But I think for the next question for our panelists is to ask, what are some of the areas that you see most aligned between what's happening in responsible finance, whether that's on impact investing or environmental social governance, ESG, and what's happening in Islamic finance, where we can start to build more deeply upon these common shared values.
Shall I jump in, Blake?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, great. A very quick answer, and I think no, that's the question, and that's a fascinating question considering what's happening around the world today. I mean, we turn on the news, and we see around the world a lot of people very publicly and vocally, and very proud to say, demanding a better world, a world that's based on ethics, a world that respects every single person, a world that is that stresses on equity, and I think a lot of these principles are embedded within some of the things that we seek in ESG within companies as well. So as companies begin more and more to find their purpose of being, of why and how they're actually generating their profits, and how we are actually being asked to scrutinize that. And I'm proud to say, and especially among our younger generation, whether you're a consumer, whether you're in the supply chain, you are asked to scrutinize how a company is operating based on their environmental, social, and governance policies and actions as well. As we look within responsible finance and impact investing, a lot of these principles are being used for screening purposes as well. Now, as you know, as is well known globally, ESG has very many standards today, and the screening principles are very different, but similar, but with some differentiation. If we contrast this with, for example, Islamic finance and the screening principles that are being used there, there is a lot of consistency, there is a lot of standardization, but I think there is also a lot of key principles that are rooted not just in the faith, but in the conduct of Islamic finance. And within that, we can see things like, for example, we spoke about human rights. We spoke about, labor practices. We've spoken about environmental concerns, emissions, etc. And these are, if we're talking about commonalities and alignment, these are most definitely, I find, very aligned. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we actually have Philippe has joined, so I'll sort of direct that question to him as you give your introduction, to also reflect on the specific example that's attracted you to Islamic finance, as well as the commonality with responsible finance. I think
Unmute first, unmute.
Ah, there.
Okay.
There.
Me? You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about the technical problem. Hi everyone. Thanks everyone, the dear panelists, the KNEKS team, and brother Sudara. Quickly talking about myself. I discovered Islamic finance when I was studying Arabic in Arabic countries back in 2010. And as an economist, it aroused my curiosity. And later, joining the same view on Mr. Suvorov, I noticed that Islamic finance wasn't affected by the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, basically because they cannot invest in the subprime. So Islamic Bank wasn't full, didn't have any junk bonds. So that made them more ethical. And I wanted to go further because the world was in need of more ethical practice and to an economy that serve humans, that serve the real economy. So I decided to go further and to do a diploma in Bahrain, a first diploma, and then to go further and do an MBA in Islamic finance. So that was my first approach of Islamic finance because of the ethical side of it. Then also I saw the potential of it because Islamic finance since early 2000, 2005, 2008 is growing with a constant rate of 10 to 15%. So it's also the potential of it and the bridge you can build between Western world and Islamic world. And that's it. So this both aspects, the ethical aspect and the business opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the contrast made with what are the discussions between responsible finance and Islamic finance today, and what some of the commonality that we saw coming out of the financial crisis, where there was really that greater connection to the real economy and preference or avoidance of debt that helped distinguish Islamic finance in some ways from how it was affected. So it was affected through the second order real economy effects, but not directly through the financial meltdown with the financial products that caused most of the problem. Whereas right now we see a different spot for Islamic finance where it's being affected at the same time equally as much as conventional finance, because it's connected to the real economy, and what COVID is doing to the real economy is passing through to all financial institutions. And so I'd like to touch on a point that Margie was mentioning about, you can look at the sustainability, the ESG element on the one hand, and then you can go into some of the more global principles around the labor rights, environment, some of the things that have been covered by the UN Global Compact. And so I just wanted to ask if some of the other panelists wanted to weigh in and see, compared to the financial crisis, what can Islamic finance do differently this time in terms of learning and finding bridges across between itself and responsible finance?
All right, if I may, I'll say a couple words. First of all, I'd like to say that I think all finance is responsible finance, because like under the financial institutions, their goal is to earn profit for their deposit holders and their shareholders through implementing various contracts with its clients. If it's not, then it's called charity, and social and environmental and governance stuff is very, very important. However, it is implemented through regulation by governments that realize that this is an important part of their societies, and that financial institutions and other institutions and, let's say, manufacturers, they should comply with that. So by reaching bigger moral and ethical practices, it could be done through regulation. What is lacking is that the unity in the world. There should be some kind of universal regulation around ethics and morale. Right now, there's hype for morale, and let's say that Homo sapiens is becoming Homo moralis based on morale, right? That you will try to avoid exploitation and usury as much as possible. And in that respect, I think that there should not be any adjustments done to Islamic finance in order for it to be more responsible, right? However, it should be more compatible with conventional finance. And it could be done by making it cheaper to implement. I mean, even in Indonesia, in other parts of the world, as an earlier speaker mentioned, most of the contracts, most of the practices, they're purely copied from conventional finance, and then several contract layers are built on top of it in order for it to be at least partly Sharia compliant. And by implementing several contracts, it becomes more expensive and more difficult for everyone to understand. In that way, technology may help. And with technology, I mean, while creating Islamic or Sharia compliant products, you can use, like, you can, I don't know, I'm not an IT guy. However, I work with a lot of startups, so I know how it could be done. You could put the contractual text and everything in terms and conditions. However, you can say in the beginning of the app or whatever that you are implementing some responsibility or some sharing principles, like zakat, for example, right? It's a really, really interesting and great thing that could be applied throughout the world. However, it's not going to work if only one part of the country or one part of the world will implement that and the other won't. That makes the part that will implement this additional, let's call it tax, right? It's additional taxation. It will be less competitive. We will be losing 2.5% of profits, and that's a lot. And by that, it will be difficult for those institutions that implement this stuff to survive in a very competitive world. Now, touching bases on financial crisis, the previous financial crisis and today's financial crisis, how Islamic finance could help. Well, as you mentioned, in terms of participation in loan agreements, in Islamic finance, the principle of risk sharing between the borrower and insurer, it could be used to make screening or scoring more effective. But that does not mean that everybody will participate in those loan acceptance. You will not give that many loans, but if you do, you will have an additional screening to make sure that you will get this money back in order to avoid bankruptcy. On the other hand, there is a problem with an absence of collateral on some of the security issues. And that will mean that in case of bankruptcy, the investors that invest in those Islamic securities that does not have any protection for them will, like with Dubai World, by the way, will actually get hit even worse than in conventional finance. And again, that is making Islamic financial securities more attractive to investors because of the lack of this protection. I know that Al-Afi is discussing different possible protection for investors in these securities. However, there are always different communities that cannot agree between each other. Bankers, people from religion community, and consumers. They all want different things. And as long as there is this disagreement and there is no mediocre between it, and probably it should come from somewhere out of the system, Islamic finance will always be behind conventional finance, and its principles will not be very widely accepted by conventional finance, where all you can do in current situation, look at Europe, look at US, what they do, they print money. That's not how you help situation. You increase inflation, and it's not bailing out. It's called nationalization. You're getting back to what you've been fighting with, of principles of socialism and communism. You just buy back all those banks that do not care about any values, but all they need is just this cash. And what do they do with this printed cash that they receive from federal government? Do they help their customers? No, they just buy back their stocks to increase their, not only banks, even companies like from commerce or e-commerce even. They just buy back stock in order to inflate their market cap, and it does not fix the problem at all. So there needs to be more dialogue between conventional and Islamic to make it more responsible, and there needs to be a universal regulation in terms of ECG on UN based maybe, to make sure that everyone complies with its principles. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're coming across is that there's a difference between the search for short-term returns that have been common across all forms of finance, even if there's more of a real economy long-term focus in Islamic finance, and that's created challenges in terms of properly valuing the things that affect humanity. And so maybe we can step away from the bankers for a moment. And Charles, I wanted to ask you, based on your experience engaging with at the grassroots level with the communities, how was their perception changed from when you started with the ASCA and then started incorporating Sharia principles? How is it viewed similarly or differently?
Okay. For us, in principle, Islamic finance has no different from the humanity value we have, especially in developing the community economy. The similarities can be seen from the passion and purpose to change and live the life of poor people for the better. And in Wahana Visi, we can find at SGA, with some members come from poor communities. At present, Indonesia has a poor population of 25 million people, or around 9.4% of the total population of Indonesia, spread over 17,500 islands. This is both a challenge, we think, and an opportunity to implement Islamic in a more creative and community-based manner. For young people, we think there needs to be a greater effort to socialize and introduce Islamic finance to them from the early age. Might be able to start from a curriculum at school by considering in innovative facilities and infrastructures, so that they can easily understand the Islamic finance and its differences from non-Islamic finance. Thank you. That's all.
So I guess a follow-up question to that would be for if you're seeing engagement with somebody who's from younger generation, what are their primary concerns just around the financial impact? Are they around just not understanding the way of doing Islamic finance? They just prefer something more familiar, or are there the technological expectations that they have in terms of how they're expecting to engage?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah. For the young generation, I can share that statistically in France and in Europe, young people are now in need of more ethical and social responsible finance. There is a huge growth from ethical funds in Europe that have the same practice as some Islamic funds. So for not to mention the technological aspect of it, but regarding to this social impact, the environmental impact, yes, young generation are strongly in need of it, and Islamic funds can answer their demand. They can really benefits of invest in such of Islamic fund if the policymaker make everything to welcome it in Europe.
It is, I guess, as moving from sort of the theoretical value to what's been seen in practice. How widely has there been that type of outreach from Islamic finance into non-Muslim communities in terms of the consumer base to understand that Islamic finance can deliver sort of the twofold, the focus on environmental and social impact that is becoming more and more important, but also that the core sort of governance elements of making sure that financial transactions are conducted fairly. Margie, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. In terms of the general mindset and awareness, I would say that, especially out here in Asia, I don't think that consumers are actively choosing with their wallets. All things being equal, at the very least, I almost want to ask the question of why not rather than why in terms of Islamic finance. If you get your returns and you're able to impact society and the environment positively, I think that is something that that the general public would sign up for. Now, in terms of the understanding and the mindset, unfortunately, we've not seen huge demands in terms of being able to mobilize companies to become much more sustainable and much more ESG compliant, or mobilize them towards Islamic finance purely on from an ethical aspect. And I'm not sure we should. I think it's come to a point where these concepts have moved beyond goodwill, and very much businesses are beginning to see both the risks as well as the opportunities involved in being much more socially conscious as well as environmentally conscious. I think, the risks are out there for all to see, and anyone who's not, including social environmental concerns into their risk register is going to head that way very soon. Is not good news for them. But at the same time, I think, in terms of opportunities, there have been companies that have actively tapped into new, especially in with regards to the COVID crisis as well. There have been new markets that have opened up. I think there are markets that have shrunk, but there are new markets that have opened up very actively. And you see a lot of companies on the ground here in Malaysia that have pivoted quite quickly as well. in terms of their business models. So I think in terms of the widespread demand from an ethical perspective, we've not quite seen it, except, sorry, just one last point is businesses here are beginning to see those concerns being almost a license to operate, especially those that form the supply chain into markets in Europe and the US.
So we see this as creating a license to operate that is in some ways global, and in some contexts having the Islamic finance offering, as we heard from Charles, is sort of adds to that license to operate. Does Islamic finance and its uniqueness offer the potential for a win-win system rather than what I think we had heard from before, was that there was a challenge of finance and financing the economy being seen as too much of a zero-sum game? If nobody else wants to comment,
please
on
clarify
that.
the question.
Does Islamic finance have, if it's adopting this merging of the traditional governance and fairness and equity basis within how it operates, with a focus on environmental and social impact to maintain a social license to operate, is it better suited to provide a win-win option compared to the zero-sum game that we heard some complaints about with companies that are sort of circulating cash that they're getting from central banks back to shareholders and not being able to close a loop with the real economy and the population as a whole?
I think yes. Obviously, win-win system is good for everyone. However, I believe that this point of discussion needs more details in terms of what are we comparing it to? What do we mean by zero-sum game? If we're talking about like taking cash and like with the example that you provided, I mean, obviously, Islamic finance system is much better and more responsible. In that way, probably you can implement some kind of technology that will allow all stakeholders to see how the central bank financial help is being distributed and used by the company that received it, like online, for example. Right now, all they do is they just, they fill up the paperwork with check marks that says, okay, I comply with this, I comply with that, so it's fine. And then they do whatever they want with it according to law of the countries where they operate. So, so the question is yes. Adding an example of implementing social, environmental, and ethical practices, I can give you an example of our portfolio company, Goud, how it was operating during the COVID. Whether was using because of Islamic finance, or it was pure marketing, or whether it was just, ethical decision by the bosses, we don't know. However, what they did is they tried, first of all, in some countries where they were operating, such as Indonesia and Singapore, the governments actually demanded from operators like Grab and Gojek, which are, like similar to Uber and Lyft in the US, to operate, to make sure that the drivers that could not transport people anymore were still able to get some payments. It was done by two things. First, is that drivers' commission was lowered, the one that they were paying back to the company. So the profits of the operator of the company were lowered, right? It was done through legislative demand by the government. It wasn't voluntarily done by the company. And also the company was offering to these drivers to transport not only people, but goods and food and other stuff. Because most of people in the pandemic, they were in their homes, so they could not order, they could not go outside to get food. So they were using these companies in order to get the food and other goods delivered. This is a great example of a social and ethical responsibility to the drivers under the expense of the company and its investors. However, it wasn't, again, it was a legislative approach by the governments where it was operating. So maybe here we have to, again, talk about some kind of, you spoke about license, maybe some kind of regulation in a time of crisis. Everybody has to unite, and propose some kind of help to the society and things like this.
So I'll actually come back to one of the points you made earlier about the need for transparency, about how financial institutions use the funds that they receive, whether those are funds provided as a deposit from the central bank or from depositors. If you're comparing two institutions side by side, one is a Islamic financial institution that has an ongoing review by its Sharia board to make sure that it's operating consistent with Sharia principles, including with that link to underlying real economy transactions on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have a bank that's taking the more open, the radical transparency approach that a bank like Triodos uses. And from the perspective of the consumer, is it easier for them to trust an institution based on it having full transparency or on it having a dedicated ethics board that's reviewing? Even starting just on the perspective of, I have so many other things I have to check on. Is my toothpaste manufactured ethically? There's so many products that I could choose when I'm making a decision about what to buy and what to focus my effort on to make sure it's sustainable. Is my bank account, does it make that list, or am I better off having sort of an independent board that I can trust is already looking out for this just by virtue of choosing a Sharia compliant financial institution?
Can I give 2 comments right away, Blake, if you don't mind?
Okay.
All right, first, that's the problem when we were talking about creating an Islamic pension fund in Russia. We realized, how do we make sure that Sharia board, which should be independent from shareholders and management of the financial institution, is actually independent? Mm-hmm. It's very, very difficult to make sure that they act, because they are on salary. Sometimes they get bonuses in terms of the stake in the company, and obviously they have. It's very difficult for them to be truly independent. So this is first comment. The second comment regarding making sure that your toothpaste is manufactured properly without using alcohol or whatever. That's where the technology may help. Think about it: creating an Islamic bank with a credit card. And when you go to any shop, even if you go to a conventional shop that sells wine, when you like Amazon right now in States, they has like without contactless shops, right? So when you take your basket and you would like to use this card, it automatically scans every product and using its product number, and sees whether or not it's Sharia compliant or not Sharia compliant. And you can only buy with your card those products that go through this filter. On the technology level, it's possible. It's very expensive. It's very difficult, but it's possible. So these are 2 comments in respect of how do you make sure from the client and from the bank perspective that you are using Sharia compliant products.
Maybe a directed question towards Lisa, specifically around how in Indonesia, how how these are translating in terms of the promotion of Islamic finance and the adoption by a broad set of both Muslims and non-Muslims. Are these the types of issues that we've been talking about today, about good governance and the social buy-in? Is that coming through at the end of the day to consumers?
Okay, I think we need to make the flexibility of financial contract or account can adjust by needs. And do you hear me, public?
Yeah.
Adjust by needs and abilities for, of course, consumer. Sometimes we need to make a blended finance too, where government have been responsible for providing infrastructure facilities in most countries, especially for Indonesia, have burdened with large deficit and debt and find it difficult to generate resource. The huge demands for infrastructure investment calls for partnership between private sector and public sector and official development assistance. But there is still need to come up with the new innovative ways in which new players and financiers to fill the gap and contribute for sustainability. And then how to promote Islamic finance for all people in Indonesia. I think we must have a strong link between financial sector and real sector. It's the first thing that we must be strong, and that every financial activity should be based on real underlying activities and able to encourage the real sector to be more productive and support the national economy. So in Islamic finance, the ethical values embedded in the business process, since it is the DNA of the whole activities. Therefore, implementing responsible finance should be easier in Islamic finance industry. And then this is the intention of the establishment of KNEKS as a part of national government. I think we must to deem as the religious products and promotion approach rather than the principle or the core values of Islam. Its contracts, or we call akad, in the products of the complex and difficult to understand by others. So maybe the branding of Islamic finance still doesn't reflect of nationalist value. And then Islamic financial services must be able to expand their access to reach people, especially for unbankable people. So we can improve the inclusivity in Indonesia, I think. And then we are creating a tractable financial product from Muslim and non-Muslim. And last but not least, we as a non-Muslim should not be immediately resisting the Islamic finance from its name. Conversely, trying to recognize the positive side of Islamic finance through its principle by providing fair and justice for universal parties. With the simple thing, how we know the Islamic finance can make sharing risk not split to you or only to me, and then we must the simple way for all people can accept about the Islamic finance is not for the about the religion of Islam. I think like that. Thank you. Thank
you. I think we're sort of transitioning into the phase of discussion where we have some different perspectives based on where people are between opportunities in Islamic finance, like Lisa was mentioning, to promote financial inclusion. And I'd like to hear from Charles again on that before we go on to some of the other opportunities in large markets for Islamic finance like Malaysia, as well as non-Muslim majority markets like Russia, the UK, and France, to hear some of the challenges that have come up. But first, Charles, would you like to jump in about how well has Islamic finance been able to support the financial inclusion agenda from your experience?
Yeah, Wahana Visi Indonesia has good relationship with Masyarakat Ekonomi Syariah (MES) in Ternate with Islamic banking to promote the benefit that can be obtained by public. And so far, it has been going well. We have a new program model, and we require our partner and their staff to become customer of Islamic banking because of the benefit that they will get. In the near future, we plan to socialize Islamic banking product among Christians in joint activities. And according to the information we have, quite a number of non-Muslims have invested their money in Islamic banking, even though there are still many non-Muslim that Alisa said who believe that Islamic economy is only for Muslim. I think this is a task for the actor in Islamic economic to more socialize better for the non-Muslim. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe to as the bridge between this Islamic finance for financial inclusion and the Islamic finance linking up with responsible finance and what's happening in non-Muslim majority countries. Margie, could you give a perspective on how you see the broader development where there's now becoming greater overlap between responsible investment and Islamic finance? And I think also sort of adding in, I think there's been some technology enablement for this in Malaysia recently.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, on your first question in terms of the overlap, and I think, back to the topic of our conversation today in terms of universal appeal of Islamic finance. And this rides very much on the back of the universal appeal for responsible finance. And, this is the largest uptick that we've ever seen, in the past few generations in terms of the demand globally for responsible finance, and hence by association to Islamic finance as well. Now, in terms of the question on technology, there have been some very interesting moves in the local market. For example, there's a platform that's been set up by Bank Islam called Sadaqah House, and Sadaqah House enables crowdfunding of social money, which will then be distributed by their zakat committee as well into the relevant causes. That's very much more on the philanthropic side. On the in terms of on their investment side, the technology has played a huge role, and you can see a very large overlap in terms of the ESG principles in being a screen for Islamic finance as well. There is a technology set up by Arabesque called Esray, and what Esray does is it uses AI and crawls a web and assigns ratings and rankings to about 2,000 companies globally currently. And as of last year, BIMB Investment has declared that to be the first line of screening in terms of AI screening before it reaches their Sharia council. So it's very interesting in terms of the ways that we've integrated not just technology, but also the overlaps between responsible finance, ESG, sustainability, as well as Islamic finance.
Thanks. I think we're starting to see sort of the intermediate stage where Malaysia has a lot of things happening all at the same time. Maybe from looking at the non-Muslim majority countries, Philippe and Svyatoslav, if you want to give some perspectives on what has been most challenging, if you wanted to see development along the lines of what's happened either in Indonesia, focusing on financial inclusion and using Islamic finance for that purpose, or for in Malaysia, where there's been development of Islamic finance to start focusing more on environmental and social impact.
Got it. As Jens Reisch, hopefully I pronounce it correctly, mentioned earlier regarding the signature products that he is implementing, I think that this is one of the most key points of development in Islamic finance, Southeast Asia in general. Because again, going back to the practices of my job, try to name a single $1 billion plus, I don't know, technology company that is poorly Sharia compliant, or try to name several huge VCs or PE funds that are investing in Sharia compliant technology companies. There are either none or they're very small. So I believe that this is because, first of all, lack of this type of signature products by financial institutions that will be allowing, as the previous speaker said, for example, using crowdfunding platform in order to support earlier technology companies that implement Sharia principles in their business models. However, crowding platforms can only support it until Series A stage. So they maximum they might raise, I don't know, up to $10 million, just like that. But in order to support global growth, you need hundreds of millions of dollars of private money, not government money, private money. And where did that money could come from if there is like no initial support? So maybe it should start, as always, through education and building awareness, then trying to unify investors from first Muslim countries. Let's all, for example, let's all try and bring in to discussions different banks, private banks from different countries, from the Gulf, from Southeast Asia, create a largest fund where everyone will invest a certain portion of the money, and then build under, and then invest this money into projects that are being developed in, first of all, in various universities across the regions, because there are smart people everywhere. However, they lack support. This same situation here in Russia, however, it has nothing to do with Islamic finance. It has to do with different problems such as corruption and such as our financial system and financial institutions and investment funds. They see that there might be a bigger return made on Western markets or other markets using conventional instruments, or investing in startups in the US or in Europe. You know, even our fund has Russian roots. We don't invest in Russian companies because of there is too much regulation and uncertainty in the market. Second, the mindset of current entrepreneurs is very, very different. So it has to be taught in universities. I believe it's a concept in Southeast Asia and in the Gulf as well. I think, Blake, you also asked about some barriers of implementing finance in the country, in Europe in general. It's not only in Western Hemisphere. Actually, it's the same problem everywhere. It's regulation on a federal level or on a country level, national level, basically. For example, Islamic banks may participate in manufacturing or construction of real estate, or they, like, as you may know, of those that I remember when I was in Bahrain, I was surprised that next to the bank, there will be a warehouse full of cars, which was a balance sheet of bank, and they were actually selling cars, you know, not selling, but that was the way of crediting the purchase of a cars through kind of a lease back agreement. And in order to do that, you need to change the financial regulation of entire financial system. And obviously that's very, very difficult. Some of these changes were filed, at least in Russia, in 2015 to our parliament in order to implement interest-free loans, in order to start legal framework of creating a real, true Sharia compliant sukuk, because it will bring tremendous opportunity. For example, back then when we held the Olympics or World Cup and we're building tens of stadiums all over, think about how it will be awesome to attract through sukuk issuance to attract money from Islamic investors that could participate in this system. It's great potential. However, knowing that the realities of constructing of these stadiums, you do not want to have this transparency, and you do not want to have too many investors that you are not friends with because of a simple reason. You have a federal budget. Let's say they give you, I don't know, $100 million of people's money to invest into a stadium. You actually spend 50 million and the other 50 is gone into the pockets of various federal officials and various participants of this countries, of this stadium construction. That's very sad. And with implementation of Islamic financial principles in projects like that, using technology will bring a lot of transparency, and everybody will see where this government money is being spent, and to see the correlation from point A to point B. So again, in terms of implementation of Islamic finance in Western Hemisphere, the barriers are a legal framework of these countries that is not allowing the full implementation of Islamic products. However, there are some examples, as you mentioned, in London by Sutan, and also I believe Luxembourg is the center of continental European Islamic financial system. It's very, very liberal in terms of adopting different experimentation in finance. In terms of building more projects that are Sharia compliant and that are global, that everybody wants a piece of it. Like, I don't know, like new Facebook, that is being implemented in Indonesia, or a bank that we discussed previously that uses technology to, because there are millions and millions of Muslims that will be using this credit card. So if you invest in a bank like that, obviously it's a great investment opportunity. However, in order to create that, you need an investment framework in Muslim countries and awareness educational framework in Muslim countries to make sure that the brains will not go to the West. They will stay inside, they will innovate. And that will give a huge opportunity of another speaker that was mentioning that there are poor layers of society that do not have any work, right? Through liberalization, innovation, implementation of new technology, you provide new jobs. And those people will be able to go through an education that is funded either by private institution or by government to learn new techniques and technology. You can be young, you can be old, everybody can work on a computer. It doesn't matter. It's all about hard working. And by implementing this, you will help these people to get out of poverty. Same situation in Russia. We got a lot of poor people. However, they're cut from economical activity. They cannot go through this barrier. And in order to break this barrier, you have to bring liberalization, education, and implementation of technologies. Thank you.
All right. I'll add something, and then I'll go to Philippe for a moment, and we'll go to some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience, who've been sending quite a few through. My comment will be on that is that the U.S. has a little bit of a different situation than what we've heard about from the European perspective, where it's less the problem of regulation and more of the awareness challenge. There are some differences between what's possible in the regulations from institutional investors versus what's happening in the market the consumers are seeing, where there's a lot more strictures, particularly around the banking side of things, around developing Islamic finance that incorporates some of the risk sharing principles, where that's not really possible on a banking level for a retail consumer, but it is but pretty much any possibility that can be thought up is possible to do from an institutional perspective between companies. And I think the second point is around this perspective on innovation and how there is a large market for Islamic finance globally that could be served with technology, and the U.S. obviously being one of the centers for investment in new innovation in Silicon Valley. We haven't seen as much grasping at Islamic finance and Islamic economy companies by venture funders in Silicon Valley, which I think comes down more to the question that we've touched on several times around awareness about why Islamic finance has value for everyone, as well as the possibility of the market isn't as niche as it appears from the U.S. perspective, where the U.S. is a minority Muslim country. It only has 1% to 2% of the population who are Muslim, and so for investors looking here who haven't had as much outreach from other parts of the world where the Muslim population is larger, will perceive that it's either a fragmented or a niche market that isn't worth their effort compared to another venture that doesn't have a specific religion-based ethical framework that inspires it. So I think I'll turn it to Philippe for a comment if he wants to add something on the challenges from France for Islamic finance before we then move on to some of the question and answer.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, if you just allow me to go to your previous question, like a brief comment. When it's about how Islamic banks conduct investment, my knowledge to what I monitor in Malaysia, Bahrain, even Europe, Islamic banks doesn't make like a thorough review to the ECR as you mentioned. They stay very, very, very simple, very practical, and they just do this two screening, which is qualitative and quantitative. Like if the business is halal or not, and then if the financial ratio to the company comply to the Sharia principle. And then it depends also from country to country because of the school of jurisprudence that can vary from Malaysia to Saudi. Then there also the difference between the Islamic banks, because each Islamic bank has its own standards. Also, it varies from central bank to central bank from each country. Now, coming to your last question about the hurdle or the barrier of from non-Muslim countries to Islamic finance. Talking to my personal situation in France, it really depends on the policymaker. Like in France in 2008, we had the former Minister of Economy, which is Christine Lagarde, which is the former managing director of IMF, International Monetary Fund, and now she's the CEO of the European Central Bank. She said that France needs to adapt the legal framework to welcome the Islamic finance. Because when it comes to the classical case of Murabbaha, which make up the 70% of an Islamic bank balance sheet, they need to adapt it as there won't be any double taxation. Double taxation because it's two-way sales. And since then, nothing has been done for it. So why about it? Maybe it's because of the society and because of the society model France want to provide. Maybe French policymakers, French government doesn't want to push Muslim to adopt like more Islamic practice, such as Islamic finance. You won't find this in any books, on any paper, but this is the feeling I'm getting for France, because France is secular and it has a model of assimilationist model to the Muslim population. And this is different from UK, when in UK, like money talks, money comes first, business comes first. And also in UK, for the Muslim population, you can see in UK Muslim living aside of the society, or even like UK society let Muslim to with their own customs. You can see like in the border from all the culture. Also, we have the Sikh people, the Hindu people wearing the turban in the airport. In France, no, like for all of if you work as a public servant, you have to retrieve you are not allowed to wear the hijab and everything. So maybe France doesn't want doesn't want to cut off Muslims from the society, which can be discussed, which can be wrong, but maybe that can be beginning of an answer.
I think
also the Muslim. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Do you want to make one?
Sorry. Also the Muslim population in France tend to be more secular and not really in need of Islamic finance, because you see in all of these books in Islamic finance, they will draw some charts and make statistics of Muslim population. In this non-Muslim country, there is this number, this proportion of Muslims, so there is a potential for Islamic finance. So sometimes it's not the case, like in France or Germany, it costs the most populous Muslim population in terms of number, figures, and percentage. However, Islamic finance is not developed in this country. In UK it is, and as Mr. Suvorov mentioned, Luxembourg is a platform on Islamic finance, and Islamic finance is well developed there, and Luxembourg doesn't host a big number of, it's like a quasi non-Muslim population in Luxembourg. So it depends on the policymaker, on the government to welcome Islamic finance. This has to be done.
Okay, just to sort of build upon that point about the challenges of Islamic finance developing in non-Muslim majority countries, and going into one of the questions that we have from the audience, who was asking about why are non-Muslims starting to adopt Islamic finance? Is it for seeking greater profit, or is it wanting to do more for humanity, or another reason? And I think one of the things we can take away from this is, and I'd like people to comment on, is if you were presenting to a government minister in a country like France or another non-Muslim majority country about why they should open up and enable Islamic finance to be accessible, regardless of whether it's it has the name Islamic finance just on its own characteristics. What would you say has been the most common reason for adoption among non-Muslims for Islamic finance?
Yeah. Black?
Yeah.
Yes. In Indonesia, currently around 30% of Indonesia population is non-Muslim. But when we view in terms of economic potential, the opportunities are quite large. For most of non-Muslim Indonesia, the Islamic economy is better known through Islamic banks, only Islamic banks, but in cities throughout Indonesia. Unfortunately, this information about Islamic banking is more widely understood among Muslims because some terms in Islamic banking use Arabic terms. Because of their lack of understanding of Arabic terms, this can cause doubts of non-Muslim to join Islamic banking. I think that is a challenge here. Thank you.
Yeah, Blake, if I could add on to that.
Go ahead, yeah.
I completely agree. I think, I think at some point we need to realize that there might be a messaging issue. That generally in terms of one is terminology, and in terms of one is the complexity of the terminology, but also in terms of does the terminology itself exclude rather than include. But at the same time, weighing that very carefully with not diluting the value that Islamic finance brings by using those terms and whether those terms are replicable in any other words as well. But at the same time, in terms of the answering your question in terms of the appeal of Islamic finance, I think it goes back to the search globally for fair and just financial systems. Now, in terms of the mass appeal, I think we also have to look at the end of the day, I think, the elephant in the room is always the yield. At the end of the day, are people willing to give up yield for ethics? And is there a point where we can say, all things being equal, why would you not choose a more ethical solution? Thank you.
Thanks. To our other panelists want to weigh in on this? My thought is in line with what Margie has said about the sort of can you get an equivalent and that delivers something else from either a social, environmental, or governance in terms of equity in the transactions. And I think that the terminology does sometimes challenge people who are not familiar with Islamic finance to understand that underlying conception, which I think motivates Islamic finance from the start, which is the concern for equity and justice in commercial transactions as in other places. And I think that's been one of the universal values that's always the more I've thought about and been engaged in Islamic finance has been the one that's stuck with me the most, more than the forms of the transactions or the ethos towards the real economy or towards profit sharing. The biggest thing that's really stuck with me is the focus on equity and justice in transactions. The term I like to use is transactional equity because it's focused very much on the interaction between the parties to a transaction that doesn't get as much focus from other parts of the financial sector that are focused on just on that bottom line issue. And so I think at this point we're going to pull up the results of the poll. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we had thanks to everyone who's joined, who filled in the poll. The first question that we had was, do you think Islamic finance has shown its inclusivity? And we had a widespread agreement that it has, which I'm glad to see, where 84% believe that it does show its inclusivity. And I think part of the 16% may be the issue that we were just discussing about some of the complexity and challenges of understanding and lack of awareness about how Islamic finance works in practice. On the second question, the main appeal of Islamic finance is the universal values, which again, I'm glad to see, because that was really the motivation for this session, was to see if there's that broad appreciation of the universal values of Islamic finance. We also saw that Sharia compliance was a significant appeal, which I think we've seen as largely how it's been solidified its place within the market, particularly among Muslim consumers, but I think with some potential where some of the governance elements of the Sharia compliance process can provide benefit to people who are not concerned about it just from a religious perspective. And we didn't find as much feeling from the participants here that there was a real uniqueness of the products. And that may be a question of sort of theory versus practice, about how much of the theory behind Islamic finance is concerned for society, for the environment, for profit and loss sharing, has actually been able to translate in the environment that's been designed for conventional financial institutions. And so that covers the poll questions. And so I really wanted to just quickly wrap it up by reiterating the point that we came here was that there is broad agreement that there are shared values between responsible finance and Islamic finance. And from a non-Muslim perspective, that's really what provides the appeal to me, and I think to a lot of other people and to our panelists. And the degree to which the shared values, even though there's distinctiveness, has remained inclusive for people regardless of their religious background to become part of Islamic finance. There's lots of non-Muslims researching, working in Islamic financial institutions, as well as customers of Islamic financial institutions drawn by those fundamental practices. We saw from the poll question that there hasn't been as much uniqueness, and that I think gets into touches upon a lot of points that we discussed today about how much transparency and awareness is available, how enabling the regulatory systems are to the development of Islamic finance, which we've seen differs widely from Muslim majority countries where Islamic finance has been encouraged and promoted, like Malaysia and Indonesia, to places like France and Russia, where it has not been able to get the support for changing the regulations the way that would be needed for it to grow larger. And then the US, that tends to have a more neutral regulatory system, but has still some of these base awareness gaps that have prevented greater engagement from financial institutions, from investors, from venture capitalists in the US into the Islamic finance market globally, which in part could help overcome some of the challenges that Islamic finance is being used to try to address, which we've heard in the Malaysian context in terms of development of crowdfunding and charity-focused crowdfunding platforms like Sadaqah House, as well as in Indonesia, where we've heard about the ASCAs, the community finance organizations that are trying to promote financial inclusion. So I think from here we have clearly more work to do to build awareness of how Islamic finance operates and to ensure that it continues to move towards its fundamental principles. But I think that's a good place to leave my wrap up for the session. We'll have a survey as soon as the session's over, and so I'd encourage everyone to fill that out. Thank you again for participating today, and you can find more information about the RFI Foundation at www.rfi-foundation.org. And I'd like to thank our co-organizers, MES, Prudential Indonesia, and KNEKS for helping to put this on. I think it's been been a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blake. Thank you very much. And please
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
It
you
was a
very much, Blake. Thanks, everyone. Makasih.
Terima kasih,
I
Pak
tried to
Kas.
answer to the participants. I tried to answer to as many questions as possible online. Sorry that I did not answer all of them.
Thank you, Svyatoslav. It was very nice webinar, alhamdulillah. And I hope.
Thank you, Sutan, for inviting.
Thank you, Margie. Margie.
Thank you, Pak.
Terima kasih banyak.
Sama-sama.
Saudara.
Thanks, Margie.
Thanks,
Oh,
Blake.
sir, maybe you want to take a picture?
Oh, yeah. Philippe, please turn on your video. Saudara.
And Balisa?
Ya. Merci buku, saudara. Merci buku.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih untuk kamu.
Yeah.
I studied French for 14 years and I think I forgot everything. But I still remember a little bit of Arabic from Bahrain.
Yeah.
Slow
Я чуть-чуть говорит по-русски тоже.
О, спасибо. أنا طالب في البحرين. في الجامعة.
أنا إذا أتكلم العربي بطلاقة.
Selama dia punya tanggung jawab gitu.
Assalamualaikum, Philippe. Antaze. Philippe.
Sorry, yeah.
Selamat.
I said I can also speak Arabic. In Arabic.
تتكلم عربي.
نعم أنا أتكلم عربي. وأنت؟
شوية.
جيد.
Okay, Daryl. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for
going back to work.
Yeah, bye-bye.